Hello, welcome to today's PERITIA lectures on the theme of on truths, trust in the age of disinformation. The PERITIA public lectures conducted via Zoom are one of the outputs of our interdisciplinary research project on policy, expertise and trust funded by the European Commission. Today's lecture and the lecture series on truths are organized by the Center for Ethics in Public Life, University College Dublin, and the American University of Armenia. I am Maria Baghramian. I'm the coordinator and project leader of PERITIA. I'd like to take a minute to welcome our Armenian viewers and listeners. Դասախոսության, հույսով եմ կարողանաք դուք լսեք մեր դասախոսությունը անգլերենով կամ թե հայերեն թարգմանությունով. Our today's speaker, I'm very pleased to say, is Professor Åsa Wikforss. I apologize for the delay in arranging a replacement lecture for Åsa, who had, for personal and very sad reason, had to cancel her initial opening lecture planned back in September. Professor Wikforss is professor of theoretical philosophy at Stockholm University and does research in the intersection of philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and topics of externalism. But like many of us in philosophy in recent years, he has been compelled to move towards public topics relevant to ongoing political and social issues. And in 2019, I'm glad to say she was awarded a very large interdisciplinary fund for running a project on knowledge resistance, the topic of today's lecture. And in that project, she's looking at the causes, consequences, and cures for knowledge resistance. Knowledge resistance is fundamentally connected with the questions of trust in science, truth, and other topics that are central to the PERITIA's webinars and also our project in general. So I'm very pleased to have Åsa here. Also, I'm glad to say that Åsa's two latest books that have been published in Swedish, the book Alternative Facts, published back in 2017, and Why Democracy, published very recently, are going to be being translated into English and will appear very soon. And I'm hoping Åsa will take a bit of time later on, maybe to tell us about how her first book is being used by schools in Sweden and how the funding for that came about and what impact it has had. But at this stage, I would like to invite Professor Wikforss to speak on knowledge resistance. Thank you, Åsa.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you everyone for your patience. I'm really sorry that I had to cancel last time. Very, very, very happy to be re-invited here. Yes, I'm going to talk about knowledge resistance, and I'm going to try to share my screen as always. That looks okay. Yes, this will be a philosophy talk. I'm a philosopher, so it will be on the sort of foundational issues relating to the strange phenomenon of knowledge resistance. It is one of those terms that we throw around a lot these days, for a good reason, perhaps. We often joke about it, even. It's become almost like a pejorative to tell someone they're being knowledge resistant. And so we think of crazy stuff like flat earthers who believe the earth is flat and who even carry out their own experiments to see whether that's to prove that, and every time it fails they think there is some reason this particular experiment failed and so on. So it's easy to laugh about these matters, but of course the last couple of years we are not laughing so very much because knowledge resistance seems to be abound and really causing a lot of trouble. The most recently, of course, we are really, really worried about people who believe that vaccines are not safe, or worse things, that vaccines are some kind of secret plot by the government to manipulate its citizens and so on. And these things, of course, it's certainly not a laughing matter, because they have consequences. Just yesterday, we could read in the New York Times about the difference in mortality rate between states, blue states and red states in the US, and that's largely related to vaccine resistance. So these are not laughing matters. And of course, climate denial we have talked about for a few years. But it's also becoming one of those questions where you feel increasingly that this is really hard to just scoff at and put aside, because it really has serious consequences when people don't believe the climate science. And when that comes in the way, as it does when it comes to some politicians, it comes in the way of policy action. So these are serious issues. But then it's also very important to be clear on what we are talking about. And I think there are at least three sets of central questions when you discuss knowledge resistance. First, of course, there's the very foundational question: what are we even talking about? What is knowledge resistance? And that's the kind of basic foundational conceptual calibration that's required by philosophers, I think, to do in order to go out and investigate these things empirically. And that's what the philosophers are doing in this program that Maria mentioned initially, the big program we have on knowledge resistance. And the work I do here on this sort of very foundational questions, I do together with Catherine Gleur, my colleague. So that's one set of issues. The other set of issues is, what are the psychological mechanisms involved? And that's for the psychologists and also the political scientists who do political psychology to investigate. And I will say a couple of words about that. In our program, the philosophers are now designing experiments together with psychologists to test certain things relating to rationality and these mechanisms. So that's a very interesting thing about our program, because it is really interdisciplinary. I should say we have philosophers, psychologists, political scientists, and media and communication experts. Because the media people we need, of course, because of the third component in this kind of investigation, which has to do with how these psychological mechanisms, how knowledge resistance interacts with the larger information environment, with the so-called post-truth era. And so, because knowledge resistance is this complicated, involves this complicated interaction between internal and external factors, and you just have to study this in an interdisciplinary way, we think. Right. Now, post-truth is not a terribly clear concept. I just recently wrote a piece trying to sort it out. It's been given many different meanings. One is that people don't care about truth anymore. I don't think that's true at all. People care tremendously about truth. It's just that we have a very hard time agreeing on what is true. And that's a distinctive of our era, and an increasing disagreement on factual matters. But if one is to pick out three things that are distinctive of this information environment we are in, I think I would pick these three. First of all, this is what the media and communication scientists use this term. It's a high choice information environment, meaning that, of course, whereas not that long ago, we had a rather limited choice when it came to magazines, newspapers, radio, TV, and there were more or less gatekeepers to make sure that not just anything came out. Now we have this more or less unlimited choice. So it's a very high choice information environment. And the choice increasingly falls on us, and it falls on us when we're looking through our iPhone and we get them scrolling through, or our smartphone and we're scrolling through, and all these things come on social media and we choose where to go. This in combination with a very large spread of unreliable information, of course, not just disinformation, but misinformation, rumors, wild guesses, and other things. And then a third component here in the post-truth era is declining trust, informally trusted sources of knowledge. And this, of course, is related to the high choice point. It's not simply a declining trust, it's also, of course, a shifting of trust from more traditional media, for example, to alternative media. And this has consequences. So this is how I think about the post-truth era here and now. So I will start by talking about the concept of knowledge resistance from a sort of foundational philosophical point of view and try to sort out what that might mean. And then, of course, being a philosopher, we have to start from the beginning. We have to start with the concept of knowledge. And that, of course, when you do interdisciplinary work, it's not at all clear that people use the term knowledge the same way. So it's important to be clear on the concept here. And we use the basic philosophical concept going back to Plato, where to know something, you have to have a belief that's true and justified. So you have to believe that the earth is round to know it. It has to be true. And that you have to have some kind of reasons, evidence, grounds for your belief. Now, philosophers, of course, dispute whether you need some additional conditions for knowledge. We don't need to discuss that here because all we need are these necessary conditions. Let me say a couple of words about how these three components play out in the context of knowledge resistance, why it's important to keep these components in mind when you study knowledge resistance empirically. First of all, we need to know what people believe if we're going to study what's going on. And that's not that easy, actually. There's a lot of polling on people's beliefs on a lot of these matters on when it comes to factual beliefs relating to politics, but also other things. And people, of course, state all sorts of things, but it's not always that clear what they believe. So we have these polls, for example, after the 2020 election in the US and then the Capitol situation on January 6th. And we have a situation where 60, 70, sometimes 80% of the Republican voters say that they agree with the statement that the election was stolen. Do they believe it? Well, we don't really know. There may be a fair amount of cheerleading belief going on. That is to say, they express this to support a president, a former president that they like, whether or not they believe it. It's not even clear what Trump believes here, right? So that's something to be careful about when you say, well, 70% of the Republicans are totally knowledge resistant. Well, maybe not. We don't really know. And this, of course, comes up now with vaccine denial. We've been hearing about these stories where people who are part of anti-vaccine movements or belong to those sort of groups sneak away to get their vaccines secretly. And they do, of course, believe they are safe. They're just sort of playing along. So this is one thing we need to sort out when we discuss knowledge resistance. We need to know what people believe. And this is related to the observation that's often made that we need to distinguish between different kinds of science denial. We need to distinguish the people who accept the science but resist the consequences because they're inconvenient truths. So those can be, you can own a tobacco company and resist the consequences, for example, or an oil company. But also we ordinary citizens who do believe climate science and still don't change our lifestyle. There's something that comes in the way there. But we get the beliefs, we have the knowledge. And then, of course, this is different from the people who don't believe the science, who doubt the consequences, the conclusions of science. And it's clear then that what we're interested in when we talk about knowledge resistance is the second one, the people who doubt the science, not the people who believe the science but don't act on it. So this has to do with the belief component here. When it comes to the truth component, there are lots of things to be said, but of course, at least we need to say this one thing, which is you can only know that which can be true or false. And this causes some complications. For example, when it comes to value statements, that we should do something or something is good, or policy statements that always involve values. Are they true or false? Well, you know, philosophers discuss this a lot. There's no point in taking a stand on that if you're going to do empirical work on knowledge resistance. It's better to just stick to the truly factual statements. That's not always done. I mean, some of the studies that are often cited, for example, a study on the death penalty, that is actually a study of people's attitudes towards policy statement. should we have the death penalty? And it is possible to accept all the facts about that and still think that we shouldn't have it, or we should have it. That is facts having to do with whether or not it prevents crime and so on. So you can't really say that people are being knowledge resistant just because they don't accept the policy conclusion, because values come into play. So you need to sort out here what's the factual belief role and what's the value role in this person resisting this policy proposal. And that, of course, goes very much for climate proposals. And we saw a lot of this during the year, or still ongoing, all this political fight about policy and corona, where there is this mix of facts and values that's often unclear what exactly people are believing and why they're resisting certain things. And it would have been very helpful if, I think, both politicians and authorities had been clear on the difference here between the factual questions and the value questions. For example, value conflicts that you can have when it comes to closing schools and things like that. Now, knowledge resistance then, what is that? It's often, common definition is that it amounts to believing what you want to believe, despite what the evidence shows. And that's sort of rough and ready, because it's true that wants and desires play a role here. But from a philosophical point of view, it's not that great, because it suggests a voluntaristic or doxastic voluntarism, that the idea that we can choose what to believe. And there's every reason to think that that is at least empirically false. Maybe it's also sort of conceptually mistaken. Desires do interfere when it comes to resisting the evidence, but not in that direct way. I cannot choose to believe it's sunny right now, for example. It's very dark and rainy here in Stockholm today. I simply can't do that. And I cannot choose to believe that global warming is not happening as much as I would like to. So something more indirect is going on. Desires interfere in a more indirect way. And to give a better sort of rough and ready formulation, we tend to use this idea of that knowledge resistance involves a tendency to resist available evidence. And then you have to spell that out in more detail. What is it to resist the evidence? Well, to begin, it means at least that you don't draw the proper conclusion. That is the conclusion supported by the evidence. Now, of course, that has to be spelled out too. Evidential support comes in degrees. So if you want to study knowledge resistance, you shouldn't pick things that are factual statements that are very, that have sort of half-strong evidence that are sort of disputed among the experts, for example. It should be things that are where the evidential situation is very clear and very strong. Because, of course, the proper conclusion is determined by the overall evidence taken together. Then there's a question of different types of evidence. And philosophers like to distinguish between two basic and central forms of evidence. Experiential evidence, that is to say, perceptual, auditory, tactile evidence that comes from our senses. And then, of course, testimonial evidence. Evidence from other people through language. Now, of course, as philosophers often point out, testimonial evidence is absolutely central to human knowledge. Our knowledge is essentially social in the sense that most things that we know about the world, about geography, history, football, we don't know because we've been there and experienced it. We know it through other people who are reliable informants in various ways. And this means that trust plays a central role for human knowledge. And so I will now, and it's fitting in this context, I think, talk a bit about knowledge resistance and trust. The standard cases of knowledge resistance involve a resistance to testimonial evidence, precisely. And this may not be so surprising sort of from a psychological point of view, because it's just harder to resist evidence that comes from your senses. It's really, really hard for me to resist evidence that it's dark and rainy here now. So if you discuss knowledge resistance, you can find one or two examples in the literature that is based on perceptual evidence, but most of it is testimonial evidence, where you don't accept evidence coming from sources of various sorts. Now, to discuss that, then you need to say something about the content of the evidence. If you're a philosopher, what is the content of the evidence that's being resisted? And we suggest that we construe it this way. This is something that's discussed in social epistemology. There's a lot more to be said about that. But for purposes here, it will just be this content, which is that the evidence, testimonial evidence E in this case, has a content that source S, New York Times, whatever, says that P, that vaccines are safe. I mean, this is an evidence that's available to everyone who opens the Times. Now, to form the belief that P, on the basis of this evidence, source S says that P, you need to trust the source. Otherwise, you won't form the belief, and you can't know it if you don't form the belief. And what happens in these cases then, when you don't trust a reliable source where there is available knowledge, is that you end up not having knowledge that is easily available to you. Simply. And of course, we know that one of the things, and I mentioned this in the beginning of the current era, is that there is this loss of trust in traditional media. Again, this trust is not necessarily, doesn't mean that people are less trusting these days. It just means that the trust is moving elsewhere to alternative media and so on. In America, of course, this has, you have it more pronounced than in many other countries. But what you do have in many countries, and certainly in America, is this incredibly polarized trust situation. And I will come back to that. So, for example, this data here, there we have a situation where 57% of the Democrats trust traditional media, whereas 18% of the Republicans trust traditional media. And in Sweden, for example, we have the same divide between traditional social democratic left have high trust in traditional media, whereas the new right-wing National Populist Party have very low trust in traditional media. So the total trust is about the same in Sweden, but it's a highly polarized trust. Then there's trust in science. And I think here you need to distinguish between different kinds of trust in science. You can talk about trust in science as such, as in the scientific method. You can talk about trust in specific scientific disciplines, climate science, or what have you. And you can talk about trust in particular scientists, of course. And you can find examples of all three when you discuss cases of knowledge resistance. So there are some cases, for example, when you don't believe in Darwinian theory, in evolutionary theory, and you accept intelligent design or something like that instead, that are driven by kind of distrust in the scientific method, doubting the scientific method as such, and falling back on other things like intuition or faith. And this is something that Michael Lynch has written about in his book on reason. And he discusses in a very interesting way, what are we to do to meet challenges to our epistemic principles, such as the scientific method. We can't appeal to our own epistemic principles to defend our epistemic principles, then how are we to defend them? And that's a very interesting discussion, but I won't really go into it here. And one reason for this is that much of science denial or knowledge resistance is not like this. It often typically involves a desire to be scientific. So even though there are some cases like this, and I do think that evolutionary theory is the best example of that, it's not the typical case in this situation. Then there is trust in certain scientific disciplines, such as climate science. And as you know, there are lots of data on that around the world. Varies geographically quite a bit. Here you can see, for example, that trust in climate science is very high in South Asia, much lowest in North America and in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And I think it's interesting, you can see, for example, now in Eastern Europe, you can see a distrust also in vaccines, and I wouldn't be surprised if trust in climate science would go hand in hand with these kinds of trust and distrust. So here it's a certain scientific discipline. So it's quite possible that someone trusts other scientific disciplines, but not climate science. Now, when it comes to these things, there's some discussion out there about, is this a trust problem or is it a misinformation problem? And I would say it's both, because these things interact, of course. It is very difficult for lay people typically to evaluate the truth of scientific statements. This is something philosophers have talked a bit about. And this means that science denial typically does derive from mistrust. But of course, mistrust doesn't come out of nowhere. It's typically driven by disinformation, in particular by conspiracy theories, because they are very, very useful if you want to undermine trust. Because of course, what a conspiracy is about is that things can't be trusted. Things are not the way they look. And conspiracy theories are a very, very huge challenge, also in the sense that once someone is in the grips of a conspiracy theory, of course, you sort of lose them in terms of fact checking, because the fact checkers will always be part of the conspirators, the elite, the journalists, the researchers, and so on. So it's very, very hard to reach through there. And if you look, there are lots of studies of reasons for climate denial. And then I talk about climate denial in the sense of not believing that global warming is caused by human carbon dioxide emissions. Lots of studies show that the main reason that is being quoted are conspiracy theories, the most commonly quoted. Here's one study that shows this. As you can see, about 40% of the people responding here appeal to a conspiracy theory when they're asked to explain why they don't believe in climate, in this statement about the climate. So it's both trust and disinformation. And that, I think, is distinctive of our era, how these two things play off each other. I want to talk now towards the end a little bit about the psychological mechanisms. I talked about knowledge resistance as a kind of evidence resistance, as a kind of resistance particular to testimonial evidence, and to how this is related to trust. But I haven't said anything about the psychological mechanisms. And that, of course, is a huge field of research in itself. So I will just say a couple of things, and we'll make some philosophical reflections around them. One such psychological mechanism that is clearly at the center of all this is what is called by psychologists motivated reasoning. And this is something psychologists have studied for decades, long before we started talking about knowledge resistance. It's sometimes described this way as the tendency of individuals to conform their assessment of information to some truth-independent goal. Now, this talk about goals of belief formation, also as a philosopher, you may be a little skeptical about that. But what's certainly true is that belief normally aims at truth in the sense that it is normally responsive to evidence. It's evidence sensitive. And what happens when reasoning is motivated is that this evidence sensitivity is blocked or skewed by desires that come in the way. And so motivated reasoning, it is a kind of value-driven reasoning where the desires interfere with the evidence sensitivity. That's how we tend to think about it philosophically. And motivated reasoning, as psychologists have studied for a long time, can have all sorts of psychological sources. It can be emotions like fear, and this plays a role in vaccine denial, of course, or vaccine hesitancy. It can be, they talk about worldviews. There are connections, for example, between having an authoritarian worldview and climate denial. It can be vested interests. So if I love my coffee, I don't want to hear that coffee is not healthy, and so I will try to resist that. And one important source of motivated reasoning, according to psychologists, is this sort of identity formation mechanisms, where the goal of the motivated reasoning is identity protection. What drives the motivated reasoning, I should rather say, is a desire to protect your identity, your group identity. And this is something that the American researcher Dan Kahan has done some rather famous experiments on. And he speaks of what he calls politically motivated reasoning. And by that, I have a quote from him here. He says, it's the formation of beliefs that maintain a person's connection and status within an identifying affinity group whose are united by shared values. In short, it's partisan thinking. Your belief, your cultural, political, ideological group holds on to certain factual beliefs, and these are very old factual beliefs. Remember, not policy decisions, or policy beliefs, or anything like that. Factual beliefs. It's about whether weapon control, gun control, decreases or increases lethal violence. It's about whether HPV vaccines help or not against cancer, and similar. And it's about climate questions. The idea then is that your group holds on to these factual beliefs because they become identity defining of your group. And so when the evidence comes in that this is not actually true, well grounded, you will resist that evidence because it becomes a threat to your group's identity. Tribal thinking. Now, Dan Kahan suggests that this explains what he thinks is a puzzling phenomenon, what he calls fact polarization. And fact polarization is a disagreement on factual beliefs along political fault lines. And what happens, he thinks, Kahan, is that factual beliefs become politically marked for accidental reasons or because of intentional efforts on the part of politicians and lobbyists, and then they become identity defining of the group, and then this kind of fact polarization can kick in, where what beliefs you hold on factual matters unrelated to each other about HPV vaccines and gun control and climate change line up with political divisions in such a way that you get this sort of fact polarization situation. And of course, this can happen, like I said, accidentally, or it can be intentional efforts. If we look at the climate question, I think it is very interesting to see how that developed in the US since the 90s. When I lived in the US, it was not politically that global warming was caused by carbon dioxide emissions by human actions was fairly generally shared by both Democrats and Republicans. What they disagreed on was policy decisions. Should there be, should we let the market solve this, or should we have legislation? That kind of disagreement. But the view on climate change is very clearly factually polarized, and I think it was this, small part result of conscious efforts to make it a part of a political identity of a Republican voter, and efforts by lobbyists, coal and oil industries. Now, of course, we talk a lot about polarization, and people say, well, we should counteract polarization, people should meet in the middle and so on. That's not necessarily true when it comes to factual polarization, because it could be that one side is right and the other is wrong. We should remember that. Even if Kahan likes to emphasize that everybody on both political sides engage in politically motivated reasoning, we should remember that. Now, I want to end by talking about a few complications related to this talk about politically motivated reasoning. Because, of course, there's another explanation of fact polarization, this phenomenon that factual beliefs line up with political divisions. And that is going back to trust, the fact that we have a situation of polarized trust, where trust is that lines up with political divisions. Now, if you combine that with highly partisan and unreliable sources, or in this polarized trust situation, you will get the effect of fact polarization, even without motivated reasoning. And this is something several people have pointed out as an alternative explanation of fact polarization and of resistance, what appears to be resistance to evidence. And some people have stressed, quite rightly, that depending on the subject's prior beliefs, it may actually even be rational for the subject to resist what the source says about vaccines or the climate or gun control, what have you. Because, of course, what is rational for you, the rational assessment of the evidence depends on your prior beliefs. So if your prior beliefs are a certain way, if you're taking in a lot of disinformation, it may end up being perfectly rational to resist what people are saying about what the scientists are saying about the climate. So we have a serious detection problem here, they pointed out. And the design of the experiments as they are now in Cahan and in some other experiments doesn't settle the matter whether, in fact, we have politically motivated reasoning or whether we have a prior belief effect. And that matters because, of course, politically motivated reasoning is irrational, and prior belief is effect, again, won't be irrational response to the evidence. But of course, it doesn't end there, because if you have these mistaken beliefs because you have a lot of consumed a lot of disinformation or misinformation, it may be that your response to the evidence that comes to you is perfectly rational, but it's also very possible, unlikely, that upstream, as it were, there is irrationality. Irrational trust, for example, unmotivated trust. So we think, Katrina and I, in a recent paper on this, that you may need a notion of knowledge resistance in the wide sense, where even if your updating on the evidence that comes in is rational given your prior beliefs, there is upstream irrationality that underlies the beliefs you do have that affects how you assess the evidence. This is knowledge resistance in the wide sense because the rationality lies sort of wider, further back, if you like. So we introduce this idea. The narrow knowledge resistance is then the motivated reasoning situation where it's irrational response to evidence, and in the wide sense is when there's irrationality upstream, perhaps when it comes to politically motivated trust. And this evidence there is that, I mean, the most unreliable sources there are, and where you can determine that the proportion of false content to true content is huge, have very high trust among certain political groups, for example. But there's one more thing that complicates the picture that I want to talk about. So far, I have assumed that the subject in question, the knowledge-resistant subject, has the evidence. That is, that the evidence, remember, has a content, source S says that P, and to have the evidence is to believe E, that is to say, to believe that source S says that P. But you could also argue, or we argue, that we want to include cases where people actively avoid taking in the evidence, actively avoid having the evidence, as a kind, you might want to characterize as a kind of knowledge resistance. So when a subject resists evidence by avoiding it through selective attention or selective exposure, actively, evidence that she could easily have had if she wanted to, that could be described as a kind of knowledge resistance as well, but also in the wide sense then, right? Because there is no irrationality in the updating since the evidence is not in the belief system yet. And here you have a second detection problem. because you want to distinguish these cases of selective attention and selective exposure from simple failures of attention. I mean, it is distinctive also of the post-truth era, this high choice information environment, that we're overwhelmed with information and attention is limited, and it's very easy simply to miss things. So here too, if we are going to call this knowledge resistance, you have to distinguish the case where someone actively engages in selective attention or selective exposure, and the case where someone just misses something. Because well, if they just miss something, there's no irrationality involved here. You can't describe it as knowledge resistance. There's also another case where it wouldn't be knowledge resistance involved here, and that is where the person simply doesn't have the evidence because they grow up in a highly unreliable information environment, in a fundamentalist conditions. Then it's not a result. The mistake, the poor information quality of this person's beliefs is not that person's fault, as it were, but a result of the environment, and that's not knowledge resistance. But we do think that these sort of fundamentalist conditions are very rare in today's environment. People are aware that there are other sources and other views, and it's possible to go out there and find out. So I will end them, this is my last slide, by this word of caution that when we talk about knowledge resistance, we have all sorts of things that we should be careful with. First of all, we have these detection problems. Is this a case of motivated reasoning, knowledge resistance in the narrow sense, or is this a function of prior beliefs when you engage with someone who's resisting the evidence? And it matters a lot, of course, to how you engage. But it's also the case that we need, if we're going to do experiments on this, we need to design better experiments. And the other thing we have to pay attention to, the detection problem here, is the problem I just talked about, how to distinguish selective attention and selective exposure from just failures of attention. And finally, one more word of caution. Motivated reasoning is reasoning. It's just skewed reasoning. For example, you can have weighing the evidence in unequal ways and things like that. That happens when desires interfere. But you should always engage with the other person, of course, with reasons. That's the way to do it in a respectful way. So I want to thank you, and these are the principal investigators of the program that I lead: Kathleen Glier, Henrik Oskarsson, Torun Lindholm, and Jesper Strömbäck. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for a very clear and highly informative lecture. There are a number of questions and they are building up. So as people are thinking of formulating their questions, I'd like to ask you to give a bit of background about your first book, Alternative Facts, and how it became almost a standard textbook in Sweden, and whether it has had the sort of impact that you were hoping for.
Well, here it is, Alternative Facts. It's not actually translated to English. It's translated into many other languages, but English publishers thought there was Trump fatigue. I do use Trump as an example throughout because it's so useful. Yes, so I have. It's interesting. My book was given out. I'm very lucky because my publisher was funded by Björn Ulvaeus, Abba Björn, yes. And he decided, together with the other founder, that they were going to give the book to 100,000 high school students in senior high school. So it was handed out. Well, the teachers had to order it. And that's kind of fascinating. I didn't think of high school students when I wrote this. But I do know the teachers have been using it. In particular, I have a final chapter where I talk about critical thinking and the sort of tools of philosophy there. And they have been using it for those purposes. I don't and I've gotten some mails from nice students and so on. I don't really know to what extent the high school students have read the whole book. I don't know, but I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity to spread the message, as it were, and maybe hopefully inspire some people to study philosophy when they go on to university.
Thank you. Well, hopefully we'll get a sponsor such as yours. Maybe Bono of YouTube will come to our...
There you go. That's what you need.
There is a series of questions, very wide-ranging. Maybe I'll start in order and from the more practical ones. Carol Morton is asking if motivated reasoning is the same thing as bias confirmation, or how does it link with it?
As confirmation bias. No, and I mean, sometimes people speak of it the same way, I would say. But no, I mean, if you look at Dan Kahan, and it's almost worth just reading his paper for that, he's very clear on the difference between confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. And the way he puts it there is confirmation bias, generally speaking, is spelled out as the tendency to assess evidence in line with what you already believe. Now, put that way, it's not even clear it's irrational, right? From a philosophical point of view. Sometimes it's more widely construed as, you know, the tendency to search for evidence that supports your beliefs and so on. Whereas motivated reasoning here is the idea that your values, your desire to protect a belief because you're part of a group, for example, interferes with that kind of updating that you should have done on the basis of your prior beliefs. Instead, you update on the basis of what group you belong to. So it's meant to be different. But that said, I do know psychologists who tend to speak of confirmation bias as just the same thing. I think it's not so useful maybe to do that. And I do think there's a lot to be said about confirmation bias from a philosophical point of view and the question of rationality.
Thank you. And connected to that, Gu Jing Chen is asking if motivated reasoning is a kind of theoretical reasoning, or is it a kind of practical reasoning?
Oh, very good. Thank you so much. I did not talk about that distinction today, but I usually do. And that, of course, is extremely important. So theoretical reasoning concerns rationality of belief, right? Where a belief is rational if it's based on sufficient evidence and so on. Whereas practical reasoning concerns rationality of action, where an action is rational if it's based on belief and desire that supports the action or the intention to act. And what motivated reasoning concerns here is theoretical reasoning. It interferes with the theoretical rationality, with your epistemic rationality, of course. Now, this is something philosophers are very keen to keep distinct. Not everyone, there's some debate there, we know that, but I'm very keen to keep them distinct because I think they are very different. But when Dan Kahan talks about this, he sometimes slides back and forth between theoretical and practical rationality, which makes it a little messy, because he will say things like, well, you know, the problem is not that people are being irrational. The problem is that they're being too rational, because actually, if you belong with this group and your factual belief is being threatened, it's perfectly rational to hold on to it in the face of evidence, because the group is more important to you than that belief. Groups are important to us. Now that, I think, is messing up the practical and theoretical rationality. It may be practically rational to try to hold on to the belief because you desire to belong to the group, but that doesn't make you believe theoretically rational, epistemically rational. So I do think you need to keep those distinct.
Thank you. That's very clear and very useful question as well. So Alan Finley is asking a very practical question. I don't know whether you can answer that or not. He says, my parent is anti-vaccination. I believe this is stemming from prior irrationality. How can I help them change?
Well, I mean, if it is from prior irrationality, you have an easier case in some ways if you can get them to look at other sources, right? So they may be perfectly willing to update their beliefs if they get the good information. But if they've been fed bad information, then that explains why they're not responding this way. Now, of course, like I said before, it may be more complicated than that, because if they've been fed sufficiently bad information, they will also not trust any of the sources that you come with. That's going to be your challenge then. And then I think, well, one has to try to, as always, try to reason about why should this source be trustworthy and not that source be trustworthy, and really try to find reasons there and try to see beyond politics. Why, I mean, this is a very good question, right? Why should we trust science? And there are some good answers to that out there, having to do with the social dimension of science and well-functioning institutions. So look to the institutions. Is there a reason to think this is a reliable institution and that what they produce is reliable? So there will have to be a discussion about sources then, I think, if it is that kind of case.
Thank you. Good advice. Heather Douglas is part of our project. She gave one of the earlier lectures in the series and also is a member of the advisory board, is asking if scientists that you're working with have empirical ways to distinguish between rational and irrational responses. For instance, reasonable failures of attention versus selective attention, or motivated reasoning versus prior beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are working on this now. This is precisely what we, the philosophers, are trying to do with the psychologists now, try to design an experiment where you can see what role prior beliefs play in it and try to parse it. It's a challenge, yeah, but this is the kind of thing that this team will have, we are working on now, and I know other people are too.
Okay, thank you. There's a very long question from Manuel Nunes. I'll just go through the first part of it. He asked, the concern with fake news implicitly carries a certain accusation of fake news. Nobody has proven that more fake news are produced now rather than 50 years ago. Is the difference that dissemination has become more visible and the levels of fake news are the same? Or do you think there is more fake news now?
I don't know the numbers. What I do know absolutely is that fake news is a term that goes back to the 19th century, right? I mean, when the first newspapers came, they realized they could sort of influence politics by producing fake news. So this was done in the US politics in the US Spanish War, for example. So we know that. I do think, now, of course, you have to be clear on what fake news is too. It's something that looks like news. And that's very important, right? Because otherwise it won't fool you. We tend to trust the news. And it has partly or wholly false content. That has always existed, surely, and we know in propaganda campaigns in various totalitarian states and so on. But I do think the difference is now is precisely what this person is pointing to, namely that, you know, anyone can produce that now. We can all do it. We have a little bit of cutting and pasting, and then we can send it out there. We don't need a printing press. We don't need distribution lines. We just send it out there on social media. And this is, for example, we know these Macedonian kids who discovered before the election 2016 that they could make money on advertisements by producing fake news about Hillary Clinton. There you go. It's not that hard to do, and so it's a matter of the ease of distribution, how cheap it is, and how widely spread it gets. If it's the number of total news is more than ever before, that's fake. I don't know.
Thank you, Åsa. We have another practical question from Carol Morton. And she asks, can you discuss potential solutions, such as for vaccines, use public health principles of finding trusted messengers, etc.?
That's another talk. But, you know, I mean, there's a lot of research going on around this now. We know there's research, so it falls into different categories. There's research on self-affirmation, for example. So when people feel good about themselves, they're more open-minded and more willing to take in evidence. So there's been research done on that in context of climate denial, for example. So self-affirmation is certainly very important, which is one reason it's not a good idea to get very angry and smack people on the heads with the facts if you want to get across. There is argument quality. There's research on argument quality, which is quite interesting from a philosophical point of view, I think, because you can tell from that research that how good an argument you produce makes a difference, especially if you encourage people to pay attention to the quality of the argument, or to pay attention, or in a context where it matters whether what you say is true. So the argument quality matters, and I think that's very interesting. So we should pay attention to that too. There's worldview, what do you call it? How things are presented matter. If you present something as being, left-wing, radical proposal for climate change, and then say some climate facts, then a lot of people won't want to listen to the facts. But if you present it more in the context of a free market solutions to climate change, people are more open to the facts. I can recommend a research program. We have just this week actually finished a volume called Knowledge Resistance in a High Choice Information Environment, where the paper that Katrina and I have written about what is knowledge resistance will be published there. But the very last paper in that book is written by our psychologist team, which is a survey article on all the research on how to counteract knowledge resistance. And it's really, really helpful because you get a complete map of what's out there. And I think that's where the area for future research is the potential for future research is quite good. I mean, we should do more research in that area.
Thank you. So since you rightly emphasized that this is a philosophy talk, maybe I can ask some questions on behalf of a couple of philosophers. Ode Bandini, I think you know her, has asked, would you make a difference between knowledge resistance and willful ignorance? Willful ignorance is tricky because in order to willfully ignore that P, you have to somehow know or at least suspect that P, or that P is or might be the case, but then it is not a case of full ignorance. Would you say the same issue is raised for knowledge resistance, i.e. some sort of knowledge is evolved, so not really resisted to in the first place, but dismissed afterwards?
I think some cases could be like that, perhaps. Maybe not your typical cases of motivated reasoning, but certainly the sort of cases of wide knowledge resistance that I was talking about at the end there, where you sort of vaguely suspect that Trump may be actually wrong about something, and you vaguely suspect that if you read the New York Times, you'll find out. So let's not read the New York Times, let's say. They could be a bit like that. So yeah, I think that's a good question worth looking into more for me, which I'm gonna immediately take a note about. If there is a lot of interesting literature that I missed there, definitely. But I don't think the motivated reasoning cases are quite like that, but it's worth thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Giorgio Foti also asks whether the idea of knowledge resistance has any parallels or similarities with Plantinga's rationality defeaters, that an unwarranted belief that can nonetheless function as a defeater of an otherwise perfectly warranted belief due to the proper functioning of mechanisms of internal rationality.
Oh, I need to look at that stuff again, but it sounds to me like a prior belief kind of case where, in fact, it looks like the person responds in an irrational way to the evidence, but given these other beliefs that are in the place already, it's not an irrational response. And then how it's related to proper functioning, I need to reread my Plantinga, I think.
Thank you. Another somewhat philosophical question. Tony Ward asks, for a belief based on trust to be rational, does the trust have to have a rational basis? If so, won't that rational basis itself depend on trust in testimony? Example, testimony of the scientist. So how can you avoid an infinite regress?
Well, I think maybe I'm being too flippant here, but I do think that the appeal to institutions, thinking about the institutions, is the answer. I mean, there is a kind of a paradox of trust in expertise, right? Because you don't have the expertise to determine whether the person is an expert. So how do you determine whether to trust the expert? And I think the answer there is that you look to the institutional background of the core context of the expert. Does this person have expertise in this area? That's something you can determine without trusting that person, right? Does the person have, the qualifications? Is this a serious institution, and so on? maybe that's why I said maybe I'm being kind of flippant in my response. Maybe it all flattens out in some kind of trust anyhow, but maybe it's okay if the circle is wide enough, as it were. I need to think about that. That's also a really nice question. Thank you.
There are many quite deep and well-informed questions, so obviously people are reacting in a very, very deep way to your talk. And
well,
so
I'm happy about
here's
that.
One by Chris Schuck, who asks, it seems like there is a potential dilemma intentional efforts to line up beliefs with values, fact polarization in brackets, in that the values themselves could be seen as a sedimentary layer containing a long history of earlier polarized facts and belief gradually cementing or hardening into values. So maybe you can say something about the connections between facts and values and how you can distinguish them.
Yes, I mean, that, as you all know, or the philosophers know, is a big debate in itself, whether, you know, you're a cognitivist about values and you think there are some kind of facts or not. Like I said, I don't believe it's useful to try to take a stand on that before you go out and discuss knowledge resistance. So that's why I think it's important to stick to the things that are obviously factual and leave the value questions aside. It is distinctive, of course, of value disagreements, unlike factual disagreements, that they don't tend to sort themselves out when you provide evidence and arguments. So there's certainly a prima facie reason to think they behave slightly differently. Then there was some question about how beliefs and values interact and form each other. And that, of course, is completely true. If you do belong to this political, ideological, cultural, whatever group, because you have certain values, but you may have those values because you've had all these beliefs before, which in turn you have because you had values. So that certainly, absolutely is a very complicated interaction. And I mean, I guess some people are very pessimistic about this, right? You know, the Jonathan Haidt kind of position where, you know, we have these sort of tribes with these values, and then we have the other tribes, and we can yell at each other, and we can provide reasons, but we never actually, reason doesn't move values. I think that just as a sort of psychological fact is not true, even though value disagreements are harder to dissolve. I think an interesting, nice discussion of that in Hugo Mercier's and Dan Sperber's book on the social dimension of reasoning. And they have lots of examples of change of value over time, for example, when it comes to slavery, where factual beliefs actually ended up pushing those values completely around. And I think there are reasons to think that you can do that, and that there is this interaction, even if they are distinct. I'm not sure that was an answer to that question. But
no, it was indeed. And in fact, Stephen Donatelli has a follow-up, a related question, and that's whether values can have a valid influence on determining the facts, not just leading to motivated reasoning or irrationality, but be a useful tool for determining facts. Or do you see them as separate and independent?
Well, I mean, not as reasons, right? But of course, there are all sorts of values that matter for knowledge, in the sense that, you know, if you value reading books, you're going to know more. If you value paying attention to the evidence and the data, you're going to do better, and so on. So there are all sorts of values in the neighborhood. But the values, if you take the view of theoretical rationality or epistemic rationality that I do, they're not going to provide reasons for belief. But they will of course, provide reasons for actions that have consequences for knowledge. That's how I would think about it.
If I can add something to that, how do you see the role of truth there? If you think of truth as a value, and so then that will guide you.
No, I don't. Well, I mean, or if you, as an individual, think it's valuable to have true beliefs, that can certainly guide you. And in fact, there are interesting empirical data there, which is that, for example, when it comes to fake news, if you prime people to value truth and trustworthiness and things like that, they're more able to expose fake news. So it seems if you can put that up there, and make that salient, it has consequences, which is maybe one reason it's been worrisome that there's been a lot of sort of skepticism about the possibility of truth and knowledge and these things from certain quarters. Make the importance of truth salient, and it matters, and it has consequences.
Thank you. Mehdad Adi asks an empirical question, I think. He asks, is there any research about the correlation between life quality index and knowledge resistance in different societies?
No, not that I know of. That's an interesting question. But of course, there is this kind of stunning data the other day of mortality from COVID in the US, depending on whether you live in a blue or a red state. So that's a consequence.
So if I can put a plug in for our research project, PERITIA, we are just starting to conduct quite a large-scale research on trust and trust in science, etc., and then correlating it with various other factors, including social status.
Well, that, of course, is super interesting, right? And we do know that, let's say this, at least, we know that life quality is higher in well-functioning democracies. We also know that trust is higher in well-functioning democracies. Mm-hmm. So that connection there is. Whether knowledge resistance is connected to this, I don't know. But trust, I certainly believe, and I would love to see your results on that. Yeah.
We'll make it public as soon as we can. Thanks. I think that, as your talk has shown, there are obvious connections between trust and knowledge resistance. It's just to work out how the connections work out.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Eros Carvalho is asking, what could we do to minimize the risk of distrust in science and in traditional media? Do you think we should regulate them in some way, regulate social media in some way?
Yes, yes, that we certainly have to do. It's become quite clear, right? I mean, the idea has been for a while that they will self-regulate. We know now that they won't do that unless they really, they won't do that. From the Haugen testimony the other week, if nothing else, that Facebook knew fully well what was going on, and they could tweak their algorithms, for example, in a way that would promote reliable information, but they don't. They don't have financial incentives. So yes, we need to regulate. Then there's a completely different question, of course. What should we as sort of scientists or researchers do to promote trust in science? And that I find quite interesting, because it's, for example, I don't know what it was like in the UK, but in Sweden during Corona, there's been a lot of ugly fighting in public between scientists about this and that, and we have, hateful speech. I think that really is a very bad idea, because then you are representing science, academia, and if you behave like that, why should people trust you? So we should behave well in the public debate. That is certainly a foundational thing here, but we should also go out and communicate in a clear way. And I see, like Maria said, that's what I do these days about these questions in public in Sweden, because I think when a societal issue becomes important and you happen to have some knowledge that relates to it, you should go out and talk.
So you have spent a long time answering, now I count 13 questions, which is quite a record. I'm going to rephrase one last question and maybe finish the session in an optimistic note. So Angelica Anderson is referring back to Mercier's book and asking if you agree that people are not really gullible, and epistemic vigilance will work for most people, and that this information is not pervasive and does not influence people regarding things that matter to them a lot. So do we want to give an optimistic message or a pessimistic one about gullibility?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. What I think is that we're vulnerable. That's what I think. Human cognition, because of the social dimension of human cognition, we're so dependent on sources. We are very vulnerable. And when this sort of poison gets into our belief system, things go not well. Not because we are irrational or gullible, but because we are vulnerable. I think humans are basically much more rational than psychologists believe, for example, because the psychologists love to focus on this kind of crazy stuff, but they don't focus on the fact that I get up in the morning, I know where my clothes are, I get dressed, I have my breakfast, and I make it to work every day. You know, so there's a lot of focus on the dramatic failures, and one tends to forget all the very well-functioning rationality, both practical and theoretical, in the background. So that's one thing that I often emphasize. And even in the cases of motivated reasoning, that's why I stress this at the point at the end. The people are not just like feeling something; they provide reasons. It's skewed reasoning. It's not perfectly rational updating, but it's reasoning. So I do believe in basic human rationality, but I also believe that we are vulnerable, and that's why we have to go after the structures around us. Why the platforms have to be. We need legislation about the platforms. I think it's a bit like climate change. There's a tendency to want to put it on the individual, right? Fly less, eat less meat. And in this area, it's, oh, you should all think more, be more rational, more critical thinkers. Well, we are as good as our surrounding institutions are, I think, when it comes to that. And we need to address those much more than put the blame on the individuals. That's that. So yeah, optimism in a sense, but we need to take action both when it comes to climate change and this on the level of the big players.
Thank you, Åsa. This was a wonderful lecture, and you were so good in answering so many questions. We met, I think, about in 1990s anyway, and the world and its happenings has driven both of us towards this more practical conservative philosophy. So it's wonderful to reacquaint with you in this new context, and we hope to see you in our next conference in Armenia, and we'll announce the conference very soon, and hopefully Åsa will be one of the keynote speakers at that conference. But for today, I would like to thank you very much for joining us, and also announce that the last lecture of this series, PERITIA lectures on truth, trust in an age of disinformation, will be next week, 16th of November, same time, same place. And the lecture will be by Sheila Jasanoff, who will be talking about expertise, democracy, and the politics of trust. People have been writing to me asking for more of PERITIA public lectures. We'll consider those and get back to you for possibly a new series in the new year. Thank you very much for joining us for today. And thank you, Åsa, for such a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.